These are the new flagship headphones from Odyssey, the LCD5s. And not only are they 100% new in parts, well, actually maybe only the cable plugs are the same as before, but they are new in how they sound. And so they're quite radically different from what you might expect. So let's check them out. Thanks to Headamp for sponsoring this review. Headamp are the makers of the legendary Blue Hawaii electrostatic headphone amplifier, as well as the Gilmore series of amps, including the new GSX Mini. They also sell the Odyssey LCD5, as well as some of the other products in this review. Of course, the first thing I noticed getting them out of the box is how light they are. And it was quite a surprise because I'm used to very heavy headphones, such as these LCD XC sitting behind me. And so to have a smaller and lighter pair of headphones was, quite a revelation. Now, one thing I will say is that in this video, if you haven't already seen it, check out the Head5 video where they interview Shankar and go into the details about the technical aspects of the new design. I don't want to reiterate all of those. I'd rather talk about how those aspects and how the changes affect the end user. So when listening, the comfort and all that kind of thing. So let's start with that. Now, in terms of size, let me just get a pair, probably the easiest to see. I have a pair of LCD-Rs here, which are the same size as the other LCD range. And if I just glance at my monitor here, you can see, well, you can already see that the LCD5s are considerably smaller. The LCD series has 106mm drivers, which are gigantic. And the LCD5 has still already very large drivers at 90mm. So they're still using very large planar drivers, but the new technology makes them more efficient. Now, some other changes in the ergonomics, of course, relate to the headband and the ear pads. And so let's start with the headband. So you can probably see immediately that these don't quite look like an Odyssey headband with the sliders going through the headband. If we have a look at the old headband style, with these big metal yokes, and even with the carbon fiber or the metal of the LCD XCs, or now the Xs as well, you'll see that if I put them on, they're already pointing inwards, and if I put them on, they end up, the headband is actually kind of smaller than the width of the headphones themselves. So you do have this, end up with this particular setup on your head, and they do have very, of course, nice, comfortable, plush ear pads, which are very flat and sit comfortably against your head with the the kind of sound chamber here. One of the irritating things people found about, especially the LCDRs, was the phasers, which stick out almost like knife edges. And it's common to joke about headphones stabbing your ears, but usually when they're too bright. Well, these literally were kind of stabbing some people's ears, with people posting photos of their ears with kind of line markings on them from having put them on and their ears touching the phasers. You'll be happy to know that the design has changed with the LCD5s completely, and you still have phasers in there, but they're no longer the sharp-edged phasers of before, and they have this very firm mesh over them as well. So if your ears do touch the mesh, they won't be having anything stabby and pointing in there. Now, they're still fairly deep pads. I think they're actually overall a touch deeper, although it may not look it, but they're very concave. So instead of having the kind of flat plush area against your ear than the round chamber, they provide something of a kind of larger chamber with this concave shape. The only disadvantage of that is that the contact point on your head is kind of thinner. It's this thin ridge around here, and along with the kind of very stiff clamp of the carbon fiber headband, which, as you can see, stretches out, ends up being straight, but is kind of larger overall in design, it ends up kind of providing, to me, a little bit too much pressure to be ideal. And even kind of stretching them out as far as they'll go a bit might have just loosened them up a touch, but still I do have a lot of pressure going into my head, kind of this ridge that's going around there. So I think that while they are much lighter in terms of overall comfort, I do wish they could have those kind of plusher, thicker ear pads if it were possible. But the thing is with these designs is it's not just for the sake of looking different. The shape of the ear pads is very critical to how the sound comes out to your ears. So this would not be a design that is, less than very carefully thought out as with the rest of the design. They all has a purpose to provide the ideal result when the sound is traveling to your ears. So in that too, like the other Odyssey designs, they have the the clicky slider here, and for those people who always get annoyed by the screw coming out, they have thumb screws if you want to remove the headband and replace it quickly rather than the screws that were on there before. And also, if you one of those people for whatever reason want to lock these in place so they won't click and adjust, like if you might be a pro audio person, you want to ensure that the frequency response doesn't change because the ear pads are sitting in a different place on your head. I believe they do have a little locking screw still in the side here for people who want to do that and ensure that the headband is not adjusted. Other than that, as I said, where there are the materials are kind of interesting because when you get them out and you feel like, oh, this feels like plastic or this feels like plastic. But no, it's actually magnesium. And magnesium has the one kind of issue is that it looks and feels, once painted, like plastic. And so, no, it's not actually very high quality materials going in here. There are no kind of cheap plastic parts going on here. I mean, we could talk about the acetate here. Now, some people have commented, I've seen online, saying that, hey, some other manufacturers have used acetate, or a particular other manufacturer, in fact. But actually, the reason for using acetate is not because of acetate itself. It's because of the issues with making wood. And according to Odyssey, one of the most complex things about making a pair of LCD headphones are the wood parts. And getting a sufficient quantity of wood for supply and the ensuring and the treatment of it, and to ensure that it doesn't crack. Because if you were around like me way back over 10 years ago when the first LCD2s came out and they had cracking wood bands, you'll understand entirely what this is about. It's about making a pair of robust and solid headphones, and acetate just happens to be a suitable thing for that. And also the kind of the patterning in here does look very kind of cool. I mean, if you had matching glasses that use the same pattern, it would look pretty funky. Not that you go to put on headphones because of how they look. And if you do, I think maybe you might be doing it wrong. But anyway, but jokes aside, the overall result is, well, a lighter but kind of very firm pair of headphones. And if you'll be happy to know that as well, the cable, while it's maybe a touch stiff, I mean, there's only so many ways you can braid a cable and not have it stiff, that you'll be happy to know that if you do have a third-party cable that is Odyssey compatible, then you'll be able to use it with these headphones as they use the same pinout as before. Oh, one more thing, the ear pads. Now, I would love if it were possible just to pop on and pop off the ear pads like, say, Meze do with their Empyreans, where they use magnets. But after a lot of work and research, I'm told, when I asked Odyssey this, they said that they couldn't get a ear pad system that was easily removable without kind of compromising the seal or getting a very effective design going there. So they have stayed with the system of gluing on the ear pads. So you can put on new ear pads yourself, but you kind of have to rip off the old pair and then get a new stick-on pair. So that's that with that. Now let's talk about the important thing, the sound. Now, as you probably can tell, around here I plugged them into a large variety of amps. I got out a few more amps and things to test them with. Now, that there are some good and bad news here. The good news is most desktop amplifiers work well enough. The bad news is that portable stuff, even very good portable gear, didn't perform quite as well. So even really nice stuff, I have Cayenne C9 here, which is one of my favorite little amps there. And it's a flagship kind of portable or transportable amp. Even though it does output, according to spec, 4 watts at 16 ohms, the bass was kind of loose when using the LCD5s with them. Likewise with iFi's IDS8D Diablo, which can output up to 5 watts, the bass control wasn't quite as good as it was with a desktop amp. So the LCD5s are a 14 ohm headphone, which is fairly low, and they also only have a 90 decibel level of sensitivity, which normal headphones are around 100 dB. And combined with that, when you throw those numbers into a graph and compare it with other headphones as I did, you find that the power requirements ramp up pretty fast as the sound ramps up. And it doesn't ramp up necessarily faster than other headphones, but kind of sooner. So the amount of power required, say for 70, 80, 90 decibels, is overall higher. Now, I only listen at a kind of moderate listening level, about 70 to 80 decibels, maybe a little bit louder sometimes with peaks at 90 decibels. So I don't really drive headphones that hard, but still it was noticeable how portable gear wasn't really up to snuff with these. So these are really for desktop systems. Well, the only exception to the portable rule was Chord's Hugo 2, which is kind of more transportable. It does have a sufficiently large battery and sufficiently large drive. It was designed so that it would even drive very sensitive speakers. So it does have enough power and grunt in that, but that's closest I've come to anything portable in general that will drive these headphones at least well. I mean, you can get away with portable stuff, but note that you're going to have kind of very loose sounding bass. However, this is the interesting thing about the sound, is that since we're talking about bass, treble, and mids and treble, these do not sound like normal Odyssey headphones. So if you want to know how they sound, I could do this entire review in one sentence if you've already been around and had all the headphones out there already. And that is, they sound like an extremely resolving pair of Sennheiser HD650s without the bass roll-off. That is like the whole thing you need to know in one sentence. But what does that mean? Well, if you own a pair of HD650s or HD6XX, as they were sold under that name on Drop, then you'll probably know that that kind of sound is kind of very mid-forward. It does push the sound, the sound of instruments and vocals very much in your face, maybe a little bit at the expense of other things like the treble, and the bass was very rolled off in those headphones. If you go down to the low bass, that is. These, of course, being planar magnetic headphones, don't have any roll-off down there. They're actually tuned to be technically close to flat, as well more or less the HD650s were. Now that is closer to what you might hear from a pair of speakers. The problem, of course, is everyone's ears are slightly different, and how we perceive that kind of sound will change. Now in the headphone world, what I like to call listening neutral, to me is a sound that is slightly boosted in the bass and maybe slightly boosted in the treble, slightly what we call V-shaped, so the mid-range is pushed back a bit. And there are two reasons I like this. One is because you don't get the visceral feeling of bass you might get from a pair of speakers in headphones, and so a little bit of a boosted bass can help push that up. The other thing, the treble, it makes it sound a little bit more kind of exciting and dynamic, and because the vocal and the mid-range is pushed back a bit, you do get a little bit more of a sense of space. Now I want you to hold on to that thought about that sense of space for a second, because it's kind of critical. Now you can fool someone into believing there's more of a soundstage there is by tuning gear to have pushed the mid-range back a little bit. In amplifier electronics, they do that by tuning the crosstalk, which is often not measured and people don't talk about, by having a V-shaped crosstalk, and it gives a little bit more sense of space. Some old school tube amps have that kind of sound too, where they have a little bit of a V-shaped crosstalk. And crosstalk, of course, is how much you have an interference between both channels, where people in design, you can actually shape that and actually affect how people perceive stuff. Now with these, then designed to be as neutral and accurate and, well, perfect as possible, because Odyssey are also pushing hard into the kind of studio and professional space where that is very critical. And that has some interesting effects. Now remember I was talking about soundstage. Well, soundstage is kind of interesting with these. Now remember I said these are kind of tuned to be flat. And you're probably thinking, a few people have asked, well, I saw that graph that Head-Fi posted, and it's got this great big whopping bump in the middle. That's not flat. Well, the thing is, our ears do not perceive sound in a completely even manner. Our ears are less sensitive to what you might call the mid-range sounds, the vocals and instruments in the mid-range. So headphones are tuned to bump that up a bit to compensate for that. It's just the way the acoustics work in our ear. So a lot of people, when they measure headphones, will apply a compensation curve, one of many possible compensation curves, I might add, and this is where we're getting into that difficulty of understanding measurements, and they will come out with a result, if they measure these, as something that looks flat, more or less, with some small differences depending on the measuring rig and other factors, maybe the ear pads or whatever. But essentially what you saw in that headphone graph was equivalent to a pair of flat sounding headphones for a regular pair of ears. Now, what we perceive is, because I said I like listening neutral, and I think to give that bit of sense of kind of impact, space and excitement, I prefer a slightly V-shaped sound. To me, these end up sounding a little bit more forward in the mid-range. Well, kind of like you see in that graph where there's a bump in the mid-range. So for me, and just like Jude said in his preferences, I would like to, for my general listening, we'll probably be tempted to bump down that mid-range a bit and then bump up the bass a bit. But what you do get with these is an interesting effect, especially out of, say, the Chord Gear here, which is, if you see my other videos, presents a very accurate sense of depth and width, is that you get, let's take other headphones, for example. You get maybe, say, I have a pair of Final D8000 Pros sitting on the desk here. They have a sense of, they sound kind of wide, but the depth isn't quite there. They kind of sound more left and right. Or maybe Focal's Utopias, which they sound very kind of closed in, but they can hear very deep. If there's a very deep sound stage and there's something at the back of a stage and I'm playing through good gear, like the Chord Gear, I can hear like the difference in depth very clearly. But again, that width problem. The Odyssey headphones, on the other hand, the LCD5s, have the interesting characteristic of having this very even kind of ball of sound around my head, which is kind of equally wide and equally deep. It's like a very clear and even sound, at least out of the TT2 and M scaler rig I've got sitting behind me, which is, if you've heard Odyssey headphones before, they don't ever sound too wide. They don't ever sound too much of anything or too little. They kind of sound in the middle. Take that up another notch, and you can hear very clearly like the sound stage around me and how far away stuff is. And if someone was close up to the mic, like I'm close up to the mic now, you hear that, and it's very in your face like that. And it works very, very well with, high quality, kind of three-dimensional recordings or very good stereo recordings where there is that sense of depth, where there is a sound stage, and it's not just individually mic'd instruments, they're mixed in. And the amount of detail retrieval on these is absolutely top notch. I have no doubt that I wish I had the Chord Dave here again, is the kind of feeling I'm having at the moment. It's just that pure imaging of the music, and we talk about detail and separation where, you hear a drum impact over there, and then, on maybe poor quality headphones, you get busy drums going on somewhere, it kind of interferes with everything else. Nothing like that. The quality of the bass, for example, is so good that I'm hearing micro details in the bass that I was not hearing through other headphones or previously. The other thing that was coming up was a couple of tracks have come up with very subtle stuff mixed in, which probably when the guy, the engineer, whoever was mixing it in, when they were making the track, could hear, but I hadn't actually noticed before in some tracks, and not just top of the line like classical or whatever, but some other stuff mixed into regular and interesting music that I listened to that I hadn't noticed before. The level of detail retrieval on these is just insane. Now, the effect on, say, the treble, on the other hand, when you listen with these compared with other headphones, again, I like that kind of listening neutral sound you get with something like the Susvaras, which is a little bit brighter. I like a little bit more exciting treble than these have. So these can sound a little bit, at least to me, a touch dull. And that's what flat tends to sound like. Another equivalent might be a completely different product, Campfire Audio's Ara IMs, which are also tuned dead flat. Do have that kind of thing where you do wish the treble was a little bit more exciting. That's what I kind of hear with these sometimes. So that means they end up being very focused on the mid-range. Now, when your brain adapts to that, as long as the music, say, I had some Ray LaMontagne, which is very forward and in your face with the mid-range and his vocals, that to me was sometimes a little bit kind of too much, and it was obviously mixed and mastered that way. And sometimes it was a little bit too overwhelming, and I wish there was more relaxed sound like I get from the LCD-Rs, where the bass is a little bit filled out, it's a little bit more bloomy, it's a little bit more easygoing. That's where the LCD5s tended to be a little bit kind of grating for me. On the other hand, you get stuff like Mark Ribot, which I like a lot, really intense guitar work, and that's just super exciting to listen to. And the funny thing is, I've always said comparisons are evil, so if I take these off and then I listen to, say, something like the LCD-XCs or my LCD-Rs, which are kind of a little bit more my kind of thing, or maybe the Susvaras, you'll listen to those for a while, then I put these back on, say, mid-track, then they sound kind of really kind of congested in your face and closed in and awful. And then, after about 10-20 seconds, my brain goes, snap, and suddenly the soundstage pops back. And my brain just resets. And it's like, whoa, that's not something I've experienced with headphones before. Normally it would take me, like a while, 10-20 minutes to adjust. But it was really funny how they sound really kind of super mid-forward and kind of sound wrong after listening with other headphones. And then snap. Oh, there it is. It's come back with that beautiful soundstage, which is just exactly as it is in the recording. Like I've already described, the LCD5s are hyper-revealing of detail, and the consequence of that is that you change the slightest thing in your system, whether it be an amplifier, a DAC, or even some cables, and you absolutely notice the difference in the end result. And it's almost detail to a fault. But the good thing to know is that even so, something basic like this Cavalli Tube Hybrid will drive them, although of course the quantity, the amount of detail you hear through, or the quality of the bass may not be as good as you get with a higher end amp such as this Headamp GSX Mini. But overall, I tried them through stuff that was, low range, mid-range, which we've got Soundcos SG-A1 in here for review, or high-range, Audio GD Master 9 or something, GSX Mini, or the Chord TT2. Now, the good thing is the Chord TT2, of course, will drive them out of the front outputs. There's plenty of power, being that this was Chord's latest DAC amp that they made for driving headphones. When people asked for more power, they certainly gave it. And you can actually probably see the adapter I've been using for the Susvaras and the Odyssey LCD-Rs for out the back of the TT2. But in general, the LCD5 would reveal the character of the amp that was being used and any associated gear attached to it. So for example, in the kind of mid-range we have, or the low mid-range, we have like the THX AAA 789. This has sufficient power output but can sound kind of thin, and the reason for that is probably the power supply isn't quite so sufficient. And there's something I might talk about in the future. I did a little trick where I added some capacitors in line to the input power supply, and it actually improved the sound, but that's another thing altogether. The things like the mid-range Soundcos SG-A1 or something like the Singsa SA1, a good match there, although it was kind of noticeable that they didn't have a bit behind on dynamics and detail compared to something like this GSX Mini. Also, the big relaxed sound of something like the Audio GD Master 9, which can be very relaxed and very dynamic at the same time, was readily apparent there. I mean, these are extremely neutral amps that, designed to get completely out of the way of the sound, and that was very readily apparent from the Master 9. Probably my favorite amp in the end was actually the GSX Mini. Now, compared to direct out of the TT2, maybe I feel that there's a little bit of a touch of warmth added in there. It's subtle, it's very subtle, but it sounds like a kind of more grown up, more detailed version of some of these mid-range kind of super accurate amps. It's designed to be super accurate as well, but using a well-known circuit design from Kevin Gilmore. But overall, as long as you have a good desktop amp, and I do wonder what mixing consoles are like in terms of driving them, a good amplifier from a good manufacturer is going to help, especially in the bass, which could end up being kind of weak and bloomy, as already discussed out of portable gear. It ends up being a little bit kind of bloomy and lose some accuracy. Probably that's the area you're going to really notice the difference between amplifiers. If you use something super, super basic, like a Schiit Audio Magni, that's where you're going to notice the bass is going to fail first. My preference would be something like a Master 9 or a GSX Mini or the Chord TT2 and M scaler. They definitely seem to scale up as high as you could go. So the difference in detail retrieval for, say, a high-end amp and a mid-range amp was audible. Of course, to some degree, it's going to depend on the music you listen to. If you listen to higher-end acoustic recordings, you're going to notice the subtle differences more so with the LCD5s. Whereas if I listen to mainstream pop and rock, then I might not notice it so much. So it's a really weird experience. It's a kind of really yin and yang kind of effect that these headphones have. They are designed to be as perfect as possible, and I've not found a limit so far with gear that I've listened with as to what they can resolve. And the best I have here at the moment is the TT2 and M scaler. I wish I had the Dave here again. And I'm going to try them with some other stuff too, which will be coming in to see how they perform. So the good on that is that if you want truly the most resolving headphones you can get and truly the most accurate headphones you can get, well, I can't say honestly that I know that they are that, but at least for Odyssey, they are most definitely the most kind of perfectly accurate headphones they can make, and they certainly come across that way. On the other hand, for general listening, I prefer, other stuff like the Susvaras or the LCD-Rs, which are now my current headphones, because they give a little bit more of that kind of bloom, a little bit more of that excitement to the music than these do. These are more so hyper detailed and ruthlessly revealing of the nature of recordings and equipment and everything, that it just becomes almost too much, is almost too perfect in a way. So I think I've gone on long enough now. If you'd like to read some music impressions and some more information about my review, I'll write this up as well and post it on my site here.audio. Do check out that site and all the written versions of the reviews I have there. Also, if you like gear and buying advice, please consider becoming a patron, and I'll happily answer your questions and help you out in choosing what gear to buy and help ensure that you don't make a bad decision. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and see you online.